Noelle, hey, welcome to All Things Crime.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Happy New Year.
You too.
Well, for our listening audience or viewing audience, I'd like to introduce Noelle Kohles. She is a nurse and a nurse in the nurse leadership. She's been doing that for a long time. Noelle and I met each other basically in a LinkedIn boot camp, learning how to do videos and things like that. And she has been kind of an inspiration to me ever since. And I had to have her on for a couple of reasons. The interesting thing is, being a nurse, you wouldn't think she would be really tied in with crime. At least we hope not, right?
The other end of it.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is that in the course of getting to know her, her specialty is actually leadership as well as PTSD. And there's a lot of similarities going on right now with the healthcare industry, but also with law enforcement. Now, different types of stressors, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that. But bringing in an expert like Noelle, I think is going to be really interesting, not only for the listeners, but also a really huge benefit for law enforcement in general. So welcome, Noelle, and wanted to have you introduce yourself and, talk a little bit about your background and how you got into not only nursing, but how you got into doing what you're doing now.
Sure. Thank you. That was a pretty good introduction yourself that you gave of me. So thank you. So yeah, as Jared said, I've been a nurse for a little over 15 years. And my whole background has been in pediatric critical care. So before leadership, I was a pediatric ICU nurse for many, many years. Always knew that I wanted to go into the leadership role of it and really give back to staff what I know they needed from good leaders. You kind of learn along the way of what's good and what you don't want to be like. And I often paid attention to the really bad leaders because I feel like you learn so much more from that aspect because you know what's good and you know what you want to be, and really learning from the opportunities of, what not to be. So I was a director of nursing for many years, and it's fascinating because when you look at frontline workers and you look at first responders and you look at crisis, it's one and the same in regards to the impact that it has on the mindset. So when I went into leadership, I focused a lot of what I knew my struggles were, not just like, you got staffing, you have all of these aspects of nursing that are issues, but you have to look at the reality of there's a lot in an ICU, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of things that happen. And what I've always focused, what worked for me, what have I seen worked for others that I can give back to staff? You fast forward into COVID. I had just got back into the hospital setting after recovering from a serious accident. I was in a wheelchair for several weeks, about 12, 13 weeks, and jumped right back into the hospital setting, learning to walk again, maybe 3 weeks into it, into trying to figure out how to turn a pediatric ICU into an adult COVID ICU. That was last year for about a good 4 or 5 months. There was a lot of learning that came up with that in hindsight from a leadership perspective of what we knew that we've taught ourselves well along the ways and what we could do differently. With that being said, fast forwarding to about May, I was going through my own struggles with PTSD, anxiety, stress. Never really understood what it meant because as a leader, we wear a coat of armor, right? Like we cannot be weak. We have to be strong. We have to hold our teams together. And this is what we do. And there was a lot of triggers that came along the way that I literally pushed back because the only thing that was important to me was getting my team safe and up and running. And it took a moment of me ending up in the emergency room after being on a Zoom call with a bunch of executives that instead of recognizing that I was going through my own health crisis, I pushed the button on the Zoom to cancel out my camera. So no one knew that I was having a problem. I thought I was suffering from a heart attack. I ended up going to the emergency room 8, 9 hours later, and I ended up suffering from a severe panic attack. And I looked at them, I was like, no, that doesn't happen. Leaders don't do this. We struggle, we're fine. Everything's like, we're fine. I realized I was not okay. And unfortunately, it took me to hit rock bottom to realize that I was not okay. And I knew that I couldn't perform my duties as a leader to my staff. And in the same retrospect, I needed to heal. So that's where, I took some time off into the summertime. I knew that I needed to take a step back from my role in order to really gain insight on myself, what I was going through, how that impacted my family and everybody around me, and get some help for that. So that's kind of where I led, I'm where I'm at right now. What led me to doing what I'm doing is that when you look at a lot of people in healthcare, and then Jared and I had a great conversation about law enforcement too, there is such an area of vulnerability that we need to hit head on. We are like-minded individuals, regardless of the role that we have, that you're faced with the same type of crises and stress, and we're the same type of professionals with a mindset of people first, self last. And that's where I realized we have to change that mindset, similar to the oxygen on the airplane, right? You can't take care of others until you put that oxygen on and take care of yourself. So that led me into where I'm at now, developing a program to be the best version of themselves, and how to retain the staff that we have now by taking care of leadership and nurses first. It's a very winded example, but thank you.
Oh, no, it's fantastic. I appreciate that. It's so interesting and I'm thinking about different things as you're talking. For example, you talk about the leadership roles, and I don't know really what kind of personality trait is dominant in nursing so much, because there's so much caretaking going on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think your example of people first, self last, I think that is by far the dominant attitude in law enforcement. But even more importantly is that A-type personality that I think is dominant in law enforcement. So there's
Same
a lot of guys that, and women for that, but I think women even probably more so, have that, class A personality where they're just hard chargers. They can operate independently. They always have that, like you said, that coat of armor in front
Mm-hmm.
of them. And showing any kind of vulnerability, I think, is almost personally to them a sign of weakness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming from a military standpoint. So,
right.
Being a military, I went through the ranks as an enlisted guy. And then I jumped into ROTC, became an officer. And so I was all the way up to a company commander. And so I think I kind of relate to that personality
Mm-hmm.
type, because I think I'm definitely kind of the same. But the key is, it doesn't matter what kind of a stud you are. There are things that are going to get to you and eat at that coat of armor that you have in front of you. And I think the attitude that we all have, those of us that have that class A personality, I think that the stressors that add on to them, that a lot of times we'll just shove them off into the corner and not deal with them. Mm-hmm. Until they're just completely overwhelming. So I really relate with what you're talking about there. And so how do you recommend people that have that type of personality? What do you recommend for them? I mean, it's, even the ones that haven't been in,
mm-hmm.
In the industry very long, haven't been in law enforcement very long, or nursing for that matter. What do you recommend for them as far as dealing with stress, recognizing it? And like you said, when people shut their you shut your camera off, which is just incredible that you realize something was happening.
Right. It was the opposite reaction, right? Typically, when people realize that there's a medical emergency, you want people to help you. I had the opposite reaction of, I don't need people to know that there's something wrong with me. And then when I realized that, when I turned off the Zoom, I was in a room by myself. If I would have collapsed, no one would have known where I was, because I wasn't even in my office. And that was some key factors to take into consideration, because I was actually staying at the hospital then. And I would constantly retreat back to my room often. And I didn't know why. I just needed to be away. And when we look at class A personalities and we look at the way that we are, because it's a very tough mindset, right? Like we're very hard-headed people. And that's the way that I like to explain it. The way to get through to that is you have to be the person that can recognize it. You have to be authentic in your support to help. As an individual, you have got to take a pause. And I say that, and I can say this to every person out there that's like us, with this type A personality. When you're not okay. You have to be humble. There's so much strength in humility. And you have to be humble with yourself, by yourself, and say, I know I'm not okay. I'm lashing out at my kids. You create sort of chaos in your own world and environment that you realize isn't that serious and you shouldn't. So to take that pause and realize, okay, I'm snapping too quick. I have nightmares. I'm sweating at night. And you go through all these symptoms, you have to take a pause. And I know I said that a few times, but it's so important to reiterate that, is to take a pause and say, okay, what can I do here? How do I reset? Because in the moments, you have got to find a way to reset. I have found that with anxiety and people that realize the symptoms of PTSD, when you start to realize you're having that yourself, exercise is great. Do not isolate yourself. Everything that you're not supposed to do, I actually did. PTSD so severe in the end. And I knew that, but I couldn't help but to do it. So you don't realize it until the end. And it's like, I'm telling myself this is not okay, but you're thinking of it more as for other people, not yourself. So this is where, in my coachings and in the conversations I've had with others going through PTSD, you have to think about it for yourself, not what you would do for others, but you. If you're not going to seek help right away, like go to a therapist, see if there's any meds or, things like that, yoga, meditation, things I never do because I feel like that stresses me out more. So I was like, hold on a second, yoga stresses me out. And really, like people like me, I was like, I don't do yoga, but finding ways to create mindfulness. Exercise is a big one, and do not drink alcohol. People find that their comfort is in alcohol because it's sort of like it takes the chill effect, like it's like a chill pill, and it relaxes you, but you'll start to notice the more relaxed you feel, the more you're requiring another drink, another drink, another drink. For many years, I was a wine connoisseur. I love good wines and I love tasting wines. In the end, I resorted to really good wine as just alleviating all of it numbs you, right? Which alcohol is also a depressant. So people have to realize that too, that, isolating yourself, adding alcohol to it you're just creating more of a bad situation for yourself. So little things like that. And then if that's not working, then you have to be honest to yourself and say, perhaps maybe I do need to talk to somebody. Again, you're not doing anything wrong. It's not a sign of weakness, but whether that somebody is a close friend that could literally tell you how it is and understand, that's fine. Or you might need professional help. And it's really support. I don't want to say help because people with PTSD, you've gone through trauma. So it's not necessarily a mental illness, but you've gone through life events that you can't get yourself out of. Have somebody support you to get yourself out of that. And that could be anybody. And you might get to the point where I was, that every day I felt like I was going to die because I couldn't control my own anxiety. And I never understood that at all until the breaking point. You have to be humble with yourself and take a pause. When you look at law enforcement, you guys, you have to exercise, right? Like you have to keep your strength and mobility and agility up. And there's times too where you're like, oh, my muscle hurts. Oh, this hurts. Oh, I'm fine. I'll stretch. I'll be okay. And then all of a sudden, tweak, your back goes out, right? That actually happened to me in nursing. Another reason why I actually went into leadership a lot sooner, because, even in pediatrics, we were moving a patient with a repetitive movement, and I was very athletic. I injured my back, and that ended my career. as a bedside nurse. So if you pay attention to subtle things and you don't ignore them, you're more likely to recover a lot quicker than you would to postpone it.
I 100% agree with everything you're saying here. I think the one thing that might be a little bit missing, though, is in your world, people are professionally trained in healthcare, and it may not specifically be PTSD, but in law enforcement, it's the opposite. You know, they may have CPR skills and things like that, but recognizing especially mental health challenges, I think is you add on top of that the male, especially the male dominated persona that's in law enforcement. And you look at those guys where, like you said, they are basically a police officer is the man's man in society, where you're looking at him. That is a figure that you can always go to for help. It's one of those where because they put on the uniform and the badge, it naturally just puts them up on a different level of like you said, service to the community, but also as a figure that can help in areas where other people can't. So I think there's kind of a natural desire, if you will, but definitely a movement where they just kind of it's like water off a duck's back.
Right.
Where they said, you know what, the stress of it just comes with the job. And so I can just deal with it. And you're right. A lot of these guys have to exercise daily in order to keep fit, in order to do what they do. But at the same time, I think that helps mentally, but it may not, the physical exercise is obviously amazing.
It's a part of their job.
For mental health as well. But being able to recognize when they've actually seen some things, like, for example, I've talked to some homicide detectives, for example, and they tell me they can handle just about any kind of a major homicide, but processing a child that's been murdered to them was the worst. They said, and there's a good friend of mine. His name's Cloyd Steiger. He was a homicide detective in Seattle for 30 years, and to this day he still remembers vividly the crime scenes where children were involved, and so that added a level of stress. It doesn't matter how much of a stud you are, that is going to affect you. And so a lot of these even beat cops, it's some of the things that they see and some of the things that they have to deal with really has to add just such major stressors to them.
Right.
For those kind of guys, what kind of symptoms, first of all, would you say is a sign of PTSD? And then, let's get into how do you deal with it better?
You bring up such a great point. And before we tap into that, something came to my mind as you were talking, and that's the words normalized deviants. So I use that a lot in healthcare, but when you look at law enforcement and you look at normalized deviants, that's taking a situation like stress is part of a job. Well, yes, or yes, and it is, but that doesn't mean you should accept it as the norm. So it is a part of the job, but how do you handle that stress during that time and afterwards is the key of what's going to create a mentally healthy mindset. When I think about the early onset signs of PTSD and stress, the one thing that I notice, and I've talked to individuals over the last 6 months, is the inability to sleep at night and the nightmares. That typically, again, this is just my experience and talking to others that have gone through it. That has been their experience, that the inability to sleep or falling asleep and waking up suddenly and not realizing why, if it doesn't come with a dream, but just jumping up and looking around. These are signs of your brain not being able to settle down. And in my case, just as an example, it was these dreams / I guess you would call them nightmares that I would wake up, and I'm not a person that sweats all the time, in like a pool of sweat, and just, I couldn't get these vivid dreams out of my head. And it was always about work and the stressors of work. So that's typically the first telltale sign when you start to look at recognizing warning signs with stress, not being able to settle down at night or waking up from sleep. That's one of them. We often think that we want to not burden people with our situation or issues, as people would say, so we just isolate ourselves, which again, the more you find yourself not wanting to be around other people that you typically were around, another warning sign, pay attention to. And that's really just starting to look at the beginning pieces of it. And to be honest, when I think about law enforcement and I think about having these conversations with that group of individuals about what to look out for, you've got to be authentic and blunt. There's so many people that go over PTSD and mental illness, and I think it's great, but you have to, I feel that you, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, I feel like you have to have sort of the edge and the bluntness to have the conversation with certain groups of individuals. Your personality has to be very similar or close to those that you're trying to coach, because I've had people with different personalities and backgrounds that are all fantastic and experts in their field. But sometimes I'm like, okay, that was a little too kumbaya for me. Okay, great points, but you're talking too much. And then when you find that person that you're like, I want to talk to that person, that's what's going to help you. So don't ever think the first person you talk to is all fail. It's not one, one glove doesn't fit all sizes or whatever, however you say that. But it's finding the right person that fits, right? Like one size doesn't fit all, and don't give up. And that's the first thing I can say. If I'm talking to you and you're like, yeah, this isn't working. It's kind of like Match.com. If it's not working, move on, go to the next person. When you look at mental health and mental illness, people will stop right there. If that's not work, like, I'm screwed, I'm done, this is it. And it's not. You have to find that one person or that one group that complements who you are as a person to help you get to where you need to be.
So one thing that really comes to mind when I think about especially law enforcement officers and the stressors that they go through, and especially in the last year. So a number of really crazy things in my mind have happened. Number one is COVID is hit, and the way that law enforcement, because those guys, which is very similar to the healthcare industry, they have been first line and they've been required to deal with this stuff. And I think one of the major differences, though, is because they're not actually trained in COVID response. I'm sure a lot of these guys feel like it's just they're totally vulnerable to it. So they're just out there being exposed, and especially like back in March and April and May when this was first hitting, and everybody was like, what is this stuff? And the way the media was making it sound, it was a death sentence to get it. And so, these guys are trying to do their job. They're trying to help the community, trying to keep the community calm. And at the same time, I'm sure personally, they're like, but if I get exposed to this stuff, like taking a patient into the hospital, I'm done. And it has been, tragically, it's affected a lot of law enforcement. I get alerts all the time from like Blue Lives Matter type of websites and things like that, where they're saying another officer has succumbed to COVID-19, which is all tragic. I imagine the additional stress of not fully understanding how viruses work and those kind of things to those guys was just brutal. But then on top of that, you've also got like BLM and Antifa, and there's even in some of the major urban areas, the mayors, they're defunding the police, and they're kind of tying these guys' hands. And they're also saying, if you screw up like what happened in Minneapolis, to George Floyd, which, nobody supports that, which is, by the way, that's every cop that I've ever talked to, they're like, yeah, that guy deserves to go to jail. But you add all that together, and to me, it's almost like the perfect storm. You have all these crazy stressors that come with the job to begin with. And then you add on to that 2020 and all the garbage that we've gone through in 2020.
Such great points.
And how do you as a healthcare professional and a leadership coach and someone that specializes in PTSD and leadership retention, all of the things that you do, how would you, if you were standing in front, let's just go through this scenario then. If you were standing in front of a group of law enforcement, it doesn't really matter what their specialty is in law enforcement right now,
right.
but if you were standing in front of them, what would you recommend they do in order to deal with all the stressors that we just talked about?
To be honest with you, start with I don't know whether it's a chief or I honestly, this is where my ignorance comes in. I don't know who is first in line as far as like with nursing, it's CNO, directors, managers. You have to start with the leaders, because no matter what law enforcement does to take care of themselves, if they do not have the support from their leaders to take care of themselves, it is going to be very difficult. That is the same thing you transcend into healthcare. Nurses are leaving their positions altogether, not even to be nurses elsewhere. They're leaving their nursing position. So if I had a whole group of law enforcement in front of me, I would literally start from the top, because you have got to have the support and the buy-in from the leaders to understand that, yes, this is a part of your job, but a part of that job attached to that is a human being on the other end. You're right. You don't know how, no matter how much training you have, until you go through the situation, you don't know how a person is going to react. It's not okay what happened in Minneapolis, right? But that person, that police officer who ultimately took the life of George
Floyd, I think, George Floyd.
George Floyd, yes.
Yeah.
That was one person who made a poor judgment call. That's not an entire department. Yes, there are issues in law enforcement that unfortunately my heart bleeds for these guys, because you're more apt to have it out on social media and the news than you would be somebody in healthcare who accidentally operates on the wrong limb, right? People eventually hear about this stuff. It happens more than people think it does, but it's not out there the way that it is. But difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you see is, you're right, healthcare, you're trained through processes and systems. There's a systems failure that I see in law enforcement that creates that type of environment of not being able to care for your own. And I would start all of my conversations and thought-provoking questions to the leadership team first to gauge where they're at before even working with those that are on, and I say front lines, they're first responders. Everyone is a first responder, whether you're on the front lines, whether you're, responding to the situation outside first, and you have to start there. And it's not, and I know between half of my family members that are in law enforcement, and I have a lot of close friends that are too, I know that is a huge bone to chew, to start to chew on first, because there's culture, and culture doesn't shift and change overnight. Frankly, in worst case scenarios, it takes at minimum 2 years to change culture. I've done that too. But consistency has to hardwire that.
Yeah.
You gotta start with the leaders. You have to.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think especially in the larger urban areas and they're huge law enforcement agencies, NYPD has 40,000 officers. You get into some of these areas, but the problem is the politics of the area infiltrate so much into that law enforcement agency. And I think the biggest problem, like you said, is the leadership. If the leadership doesn't have the back of the officer, and if the officer knows that, the added amount of stress that would bring,
Correct.
Just walking on eggshells. I've worked for some people in corporate America as well as the military. In fact, when I first got commissioned, I was active duty. I was at the 101st Airborne Division in Kentucky. And my first major that I worked for, I remember this guy, there was nothing I could do that would be to his standard. I mean, he would lay down everything that he wanted me to do as far as developing a new program or something like that, or even part of an operations order. I would go and do what I thought exactly what he is asking for. I would take it back to him and he'd basically just hammer it. He'd like, this is so screwed up. I can't even believe that you even would bring this to me. After getting those kind of tongue lashings multiple times, I would just go do the minimum that I had to do. And then I take it to him, but just knowing that he's going to hammer it anyway.
Right.
And he's going to redline all this other stuff. He's going to basically rewrite it the way he wanted it done in the first place, and then hand it back to me. I'd go retype it word for word what he had written, submit it back to him, and then he'd be like, oh yeah, okay, this is sufficient. And sometimes then he'd change wording that he had written. I'm like, dude, how can I ever win with this guy? But I think back now at the added stress that he gave me just based on his leadership style. And well, I don't even know if that's leadership style, but whatever it was.
It's a style. Yeah. Yeah. It's a style, all right.
Well, but the interesting thing is, like I had all these other things that I needed to do personally, as well as a soldier. And then I had all these job stressors, which I think are very similar, but I knew that, well, I didn't know that was the problem is, if I was out there trying to do my job, we were in the middle of a mission, somehow a mistake would happen. Would this guy have my back or not? I wasn't sure. And that added a massive amount of stress to me.
Right.
And the reason I bring up that example is because I think today's law enforcement, not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them have leaders that, they may back them, but then again, if there's a lot of pressure from the mayor or other politicians, they may crumble. And if they crumble and I'm totally exposed, how in the world am I going to be able to survive this as an individual, as a father or a mother, and, not end up in jail?
Right.
Just when I'm just trying to do my job.
But that's where, I think we need to start to look at having not a reactive way of, it sounds very reactive and impulsive with the decision makings that are happening, that with the right training, all of these situations, honestly, and I'm going to blanket it out there that you've seen on the news, if even the police department, law enforcement leaders were trained how to, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm just talking out loud, to proactively respond to system or process crises that are out there and not have a reactive approach. Everybody knows when you react, it causes a ripple effect. And there's training behind that. We do it in healthcare. I don't know if they have this type of training in law enforcement, but if not, it should be, because you have got to be prepared and figure out how are you going to react to that situation where it's publicly not going to spread like wildfire in a way you don't want it to. How are you going to respond? But also, how are you going to take care of your people? And when you were talking, I thought of an example years ago when I was a bedside nurse. This was when the market crashed I think it was 2008. We saw a spike in child abuse cases. There was such an increase in shaken babies during that time. And you think if parents were laid off, they're not making money, they're fighting, they have new babies at home, their stress goes right to that child, and the abuse ticked up. Similar to your homicide detective that you spoke about, nurses can handle trauma. We expect certain trauma to walk through the door. We don't expect and aren't prepared mentally to see the things that we've seen happen to children, and some not make it because of the extended abuse. I think back to that year, and again, I live by the motto, seek first to understand. Seek first to understand, then be understood. We had a patient come in, and it was a baby, very severely shaken baby syndrome. And the mother, there was twins, both involved. And the mother at that time was here. The father ended up fleeing back to whatever country he came from. All the police officers come in to talk about the case. I was so upset as a nurse. I literally lined all, and there was 5 of them. I'll remember this like it was yesterday. I lined all 5 of them up and laid them all out. I was like, please tell me how and why you let this guy go. You guys knew he was the one that did this. And now we're dealing with this and you're all here. Why are you here? And I was like yelling at them what I didn't know. And I was very humbled after that. And I sat back because their hands were tied. There's a process that you have to go through. And it's literally like, if you're 10 in line, you have to go with where they're telling you the next thing of filing and processing. There's a process that takes place. You can't just go after a guy. I didn't know this. As much as they knew that, I go, but that doesn't make sense to me. He goes, trust me, we understand what you're saying, but there's a process that gets followed when whatever it is, it's like a few steps. They're aware of who he is. They track, they follow, they try to hold on to these people as much as possible. But that was very hard, where you saw the clashing of even law enforcement and healthcare, but it was because nobody was asking the questions, right? Yes, my questions were a little bit reactive, right? Because I was young and I was at the bedside, but to your point, we can't react. And if we don't know, you have to ask the questions. And society, when I look at society and I look at the media, anybody else outside of law enforcement, they don't know a lick people go through. Their job is just to do media, right? But if you have law enforcement leadership that's there to respond to the media the way that you should, because a lot of healthcare systems, they can shut that down in 2 seconds and you're not going to find out what's going to hit in the news of what happened in a hospital. You won't. So why not take that same process and bring it into law enforcement? Because accidents happen. There's blatant disregard, no one's going to argue that. There's blatant disregard in any situation, in any profession. But when that creates such a toxic environment, then everyone's painting everyone in law enforcement to be that one person. And that's what needs to get fixed.
Oh, for sure.
You know, you know, I don't know how I went from one area to the next. I just got passionate in my talking, but
no, that's fine. And, you know, streams of thought oftentimes are some of the most interesting things, you know, how one thing can lead to another. But I 100% agree with you that law enforcement, it seems, are held to a standard that no other profession or industry or group of people are held to. And it's really tragic, because I think, again, that adds a level of stress that nobody else really can experience. Because for the entire law enforcement community to be held accountable for, like, for example, what happened to George Floyd, where a huge group of society automatically looks at any law enforcement officer and says, you're the same as the guy that killed George Floyd. To me, that is just, there's absolutely no way that standard should ever be tolerated. And right. It's because are you kidding?
Right.
You know, there's 680,000 police officers or law enforcement officers in the United States. And to say that every single one of them is responsible for allowing the monster that killed George Floyd, you know, on that day is just absurd. You know, mm-hmm. When a doctor accidentally operates on the wrong leg, like you said, you don't hold every doctor responsible for that. That's right. That's Agreed. A mistake that individual made. And that individual has to live up to that, you know, be held accountable for that. And just like it should be in law enforcement. And I understand they're on a different standard. They have different training. There's lots of things that they have to be able to do and be able to pass certain tests and things like that to become a law enforcement officer in the first place. But the process that we're going through now, where everybody is being held accountable for the individual, to me is so unfair, and it's so wrong, because I guarantee you politicians aren't held to that standard.
Right, exactly.
So,
and really you're creating more of a difficult environment to fix than you would if you would have taken a different approach. You know, that's another perspective that law enforcement leaders need to look at. If what's not working, if what you're doing now is not working, it's time to change.
Right.
If you know, and I use this as an example with my own staff. When I started becoming the leader that I knew I wasn't because of my own issues, I literally said to my staff that my leadership should be a direct reflection of how amazing they are. And I was not that leader at that time. It takes a lot of courage to say that, but I realize that. They recognize that. So when you look at certain situations and you look at like, change catalysts and what you need to do to change, if what you're doing now, and this is globally, I'm not just talking with specific towns, if law enforcement, if what they're doing is not working now, it's time to change. And what I'm speaking of specifically is how you take care of your police officers and the rest of your law enforcement team, because they should be a direct reflection of how you are leading. You have got to take care of them. If you don't, you might find some that are going to go off rogue and do certain things because it's a behavior issue. And whether you're an adult or a child, mental health will do that to you. So yeah, I would love to tap into that world, because there's so much good that people need to see that law enforcement does, and the stigma that's out there right now, like my heart bleeds for them, because really they're in a more difficult place than we are as healthcare workers. And I'm the first to say that, being a nursing leader. COVID aside, oh my gosh, there's so much to catch up on what we need to do to take care of them from years back that you almost can't even hit COVID right now, trying to process what happened a year ago. And that's hard. That's difficult.
Oh, it's crazy right now for law enforcement.
I can't even imagine. And as a director, I oversaw the pediatric transport team. So we affiliated with an outside party, EMT and ambulance crew, and they were scared to death because they felt that they weren't getting the training, and they were first responders. They're like, what do we do? So they were not my responsibility. Only the nurses were that were part of this transport team. I took it upon myself, as car sick as I went into the ambulance. I was like, all right, simulation 101. Here's how we're going to do this. The feeling that I got from their stress being up here down to here, just understanding how to don and doff PPE. What do we do? What happens when we go through the hospital? What do we take off? How do we not, contaminate everything else? I go, let's do this, dry run. That wasn't technically my job, my responsibility, but I saw the fear of how they were just left to not really understand. And I can't even imagine, I look at teachers too. They get a little bit, it's basic, but not enough to be able to withstand the aptitude of what they have to go through.
Yeah, it's tough. In talking with these guys, and that's a big reason why I started this video cast, is because number one, I want law enforcement, they need to be recognized for the amazing things that they do for the community.
Absolutely.
And if you want to see what they really do, well, the biggest problem is a lot of the times the community doesn't actually see what they do, because their very presence a lot of times deters some things that would happen. So you start seeing some of these communities where the law enforcement is not being supported, they're being defunded, officers are leaving in droves. Portland, I think, is a perfect example. The crime rates in Portland and Seattle and New York are just going crazy. And that is a direct reflection of these, not just the number of officers, but the support that those officers get. So we're all happy and doing our own thing under the guise that society is going to stay the same and it's going to be protected and everything is going to be great. Nobody's going to break into my house, or nobody's going to steal any of my office stuff, because society is safe. But the reason it's safe is because those law enforcement officers are out there keeping it safe. And you start pulling that presence away, and we're seeing it. On the other hand, law enforcement needs to do more. And I think this would also help, again, to loop back onto this stressor part of it. I think law enforcement needs to do more to toot their own horn, because these guys do so much good, especially like on social media. Like, we're kind of LinkedIn, I don't know, specialists, I guess. That's one of the reasons we go into the boot camp is to get the word about our services and our company out there. But I think these guys need to do more about the interactions that they have in the community that are on the positive, because
agreed.
Who's going to
it has to be proactive. Sorry to interrupt you, Jared. It has to be consistent, because if you start showing positive after something catastrophic happened, the perception of the public is going to be, oh, they're just doing that because this happened. No, that's not the case. Timing is everything. So law enforcement is continuously doing great things for their community. You have to get on a schedule where you can promote that and have it be a consistent promotion of goodness and not coming and going, because that's the key to show this is who they are. This is who they always were. These accidents happen. That's not the totality of almost 700,000 law enforcement that are out there. So pushing goodness will always suppress these like infrequent events that happen, because really, as much as it seems like it happens often because of media, if you look at over a span of time and look at the trajectory of things, it's not as often as people may think it is. I don't know statistics there, but I'm just saying the good outweighs the bad. So I think that would be my message out to law enforcement and to leaders, is to be consistent with your positive message and let that sink in, gain the trust back from civilians and the communities out there. And I would love to know how I can help. I mean, I don't, my head is in different directions about just like wanting to hug them all. Like, in such a nurse way of like, my God, what can we do here? Because something's got to be done.
I 100% agree, which again, another reason why I wanted to have you on is because having different perspectives on how society as a whole can help law enforcement do their jobs, because their job is to serve us. And at the same time, I think a big thing that we need to do as citizens is to help them.
Absolutely.
You know, there's so many good officers out there. And the amazing thing is, and I've heard this from, I travel all over the world to do what I do. And most of it is interacting with either crime lab personnel or law enforcement, but one way or another, it's all tied together. I'll tell you that the mantra is nobody hates a bad cop more than the rest of the cops. When they find a bad officer, they get rid of them and they are completely ostracized. So it's not like they, circle the wagons and protect these bad cops, because frankly, I just don't think that happens. But the biggest problem is, I think they view themselves as kind of the warrior that's got all of his armor on and he's taking on the hordes all by himself. And mentally, you can't do it. Physically, you can't do it. And especially in today's environment, they will eventually get drugged down and pulverized, because nobody is strong enough to withstand what is going on right now by themselves. And so reaching out to others, getting help when they need it, but also they have to be their own best advocates, because if they're not putting out the good messages, then there's no way they can overcome the negative of the media that is out there on it's just an endless drumbeat, and it drives me crazy.
No, and I was gonna say to law enforcement, again, that's another example that I had social media suicide. I get that. I knew what it did to me, and I was in a hole, but I realized how the only way to overcome it is to face it itself, right? It's like face the beast yourself and continue. You can't have one situation define who you are as a professional over your entire span. And I think that's a message to get out there to law enforcement. Do not let that define who you are and who your team is, because it shouldn't. And it's hard. It is really hard to overcome that. But again, I can give examples of how I was able to do that. And I didn't go down the route of everyone's like, oh, well, you can hire a reputation person. I was like, what? They have people socially to build back your reputation. I'm not paying thousands of dollars for somebody. How do I do that myself? How do I get me back? It feels good. It feels good when you can actually, like you said, face value, regain yourself, and head back out there. It's possible. It works. It could happen. We just got to get them. Well,
again, I view law enforcement as a whole. There's an entire army of guys out there and gals, just law enforcement officers. Like you said, there's almost 700,000 of them out there. if each one of them took one picture a day of one of the good things that they did and posted it
Yes.
on social media, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Imagine if each one of them did that every day, you
Yep.
would have such a flood of positive messages out there, all in regards to law enforcement and their interactions with
Right.
community, that it would completely overwhelm the one incident that happens every few months where it just
Right.
causes the media and the crazies to go crazy. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do
Yeah.
in my own little voice, is to be one small voice out there saying, look, everybody's going through different things, and this is the process that these guys are going through, and these are some of the experiences they have, and this is how we can help. And that's really what All Things Crime is about. But
I love it.
Well, hey, this has been an amazing discussion, and I've already kept you way longer than what I'm sure you were expecting.
That's okay.
So,
I mean,
yeah.
it's needed, I mean, it's so needed. And I've been, I'm thankful that, we were able to connect and that you invited me on to do this. It's necessary. I'll take all day if I have to. I would love to know how I can contribute. People are going through the same things no matter what
Right.
side of the fence you're on, what profession you're.
Well, let's keep doing it then. There's no reason that this is a one-time shot. So we will certainly have you on
absolutely.
again. And anytime that I can come onto your show, I'd be more than happy to do that.
I look forward to that.
But it all starts with actually recognizing an issue and talking about it and coming up with solutions. So, hopefully we can, some other folks will see this video cast and be able to look at it and say, hey, you know what, maybe bringing in somebody like Noelle, it would be a good idea, and talk about it. So, but I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it as well. It was a good talk.
Yes, absolutely.
And hopefully good things will come out of it. We have to have solutions to all these conversations. That's a must, right? That's a goal right here. We can do these, but we have to have the solution to it.
Right. Can't just be all talk, for sure.
Yeah, no, and I think that's it. But I think you said something, a key point though, Jared, that you brought up, is we have to get law enforcement more on social media. I was thinking when you were talking, even on LinkedIn, like LinkedIn is now becoming something which we all never knew that it was, but starting there and engaging them in that retrospect or in that aspect is a good start to positive feelings here, right?
Yeah.
Because they're building up that confidence belt. So I think you're onto something there with that.
Well, it's so interesting that there's guys that really shy away from social media primarily. Yeah. Well, number one, like you said, that suicide by social media, they can really get themselves in trouble. But I think if they looked at social media as the tool that it really is, which is the ability for them to get good messages out there, I think it would be huge. And I think LinkedIn would be the platform.
And ignore the comments. Like if there was negative comments, silence is very powerful. And it says a lot about you. And I learned that the hard way, because I kept reacting to people and I was like, okay, I look just as bad as them, a while back. But silence is powerful. Just stay above the line, stay positive, stay on that route, and keep moving forward.
There's a particular chief of police. I'm not sure exactly what agency he's with, but I know he's in California. He posts some of the most positive stuff, and he is constantly out there interacting with the population. He does tons of stuff for kids with cancer and things. Yeah. And he's always posting these really amazing pictures and posts and things of just positive interaction with the community. And he always has a smile on his face. And, regardless of whether that is just for the camera or not, the key is it portrays this amazing face and this amazing, he is the face of his agency. And I'll bet you the community interaction with law enforcement in that community is infinitely better because of what that chief is doing. And I think if every single police officer did that, like you said, how could you possibly get yourself in trouble? Yeah,
he could totally lead a movement in this.
Well, and I've also teamed up with the Irish Angel. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's actually out of Ireland. The Irish Angel is kind of a positive, just amazing law enforcement support group. And between between all of us, I think we can, like you said, definitely start a movement.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, hey,
All right.
let's plan this, do this again.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, you have a
All
great
right.
day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Talk to you later.